I'm really delighted to host our distinguished guest tonight, Mason Engel. Mason is an independent author and filmmaker known for outstanding contributions to the world of literature and film. His sci-fi novel, 2084, has achieved remarkable success with 35,000 or over 35,000 downloads. And we'll see in a moment, he's an amazing documentary filmmaker who has talked across the country about his work. Mason's short documentary, The Books Tour, has received recognition and played at literary festivals in Miami, Brooklyn, Louisiana, and Portland, and really features his interest around indie book stops. And so I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit tonight. And his upcoming project, Books Across America, is a fascinating exploration of literature and travel. In this documentary, Mason embarks on a journey to all 50 states, which is amazing, reading 50 books, conducting interviews with 50 authors in 50 days. That's like a once-in-a-lifetime thing.
I hear some sympathy in the audience. Thank you for that.
So we'll talk a little bit about it tonight, but he chatted with amazing authors, including the Librarian of Congress, who we were just chatting about a little bit earlier, James Patterson, Joyce Carol Oates, Ann Patchett, and many others. So Mason, again, thank you for being here with us tonight. Maybe let's just welcome you again with some applause.
Thank you.
So Mason was kind enough to provide us with just a short preview of his upcoming film and the work he's done. And so let's go to a short clip and then we'll...
Do you mind if I give a little bit of context before
Please,
we play?
Yes.
So the first 40 seconds or so is a shortened version of the trailer for that film that he's talking about with traveling to all 50 states and doing the interviews. The second parts of the video is a tour of the minivan that we use to travel the country, so you can live vicariously through us. And then the third part of this video is a montage of authors answering the question that I asked at the end of every interview, which is, what would we lose in a world without books? So that's the overview of the three videos we're about to see.
Great, thank you.
We need to repack.
Chrissy the Chrysler.
There's a lot of traveling.
Long drives.
11 hours.
12 hours.
Oklahoma,
Iowa,
Alabama, Vermont,
Minnesota,
Massachusetts,
Florida,
Tennessee,
Arizona,
Georgia,
California. It's been 2 weeks.
3 weeks.
1 month on the road.
We're all tired.
Our bodies are shutting down. But everything's fine because today
I will be reading
Speaking Bones, An American Marriage,
Program Bell, and talking to
Guess we should give a little look around our noble steed, Chrissy the Chrysler. We began with a tattoo of our brand. This is where Nick usually sits. He's right in here with an obnoxious amount of hydration to ensure copious stops along the road. The passenger side for our trusty co-pilot. She organizes the entire production and can't clean the floorboard of her seat. This is the drawer we never open. It is the stack of flat book boxes that become this box, which is a crew favorite because they're always, the door can jam sometimes. The camera bag, batteries, sandbags, the book boxes are right here. Several books in hard cases for protection. So that's the back. This is where I sit and read. So I've sat for 50 days with my legs around a backpack, and we thought it was important to show off the title of the film. So we put a logo on the roof. Imagine we find ourselves in a world without books. We have no ebooks, audiobooks, paperbacks, hardbacks. In that new version of the world, that new version of America, what do we lose in that world? What will we lack as a culture, as a people.
If suddenly we had a world without books.
Imagining a world without books.
If we lose books,
if literature disappeared, we would lose joy, we would lose connections.
Your sense of identity and self and soul.
Like losing part of our humanity.
This is humanity.
There's a voice in all these books around us.
So you're going to be missing the ability to live other people's lives.
Books are empathy machines.
The loss of empathy would be the greatest loss.
Those things disappearing is obviously it's a profound destitution. You know, it's a
Terrifying, horrifying, eviscerating.
A world without books it's an impossible world to imagine.
In general, I think is kind of deeply indestructible.
You can burn them all day long and scream and yell about them.
You could wipe out every book in existence.
Stories will remain.
We really can't live without stories.
Fundamental to our DNA.
You have to have stories.
That's what we are built of. Our memories, our beliefs, our loves and our sorrows, our stories.
If I woke up one day and there were no books, then that would be the day the first book was written.
We are all a character in the novel of our own lives.
We are stories all the way down.
You can't ever take it away from us.
Wow. All right. So I think there's a lot there to talk about, Mason.
Yeah, we can start wherever you'd like. I thought that the 3 videos will give a nice picture of the trip, an overview, and then a look at the crew behind the journey, because the journey itself is quite the story as well. And that last montage really gets to the heart of what I wanted to talk about with the film, which is the importance of stories and the power that they have in our lives.
So maybe we'll start out by having you tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, what inspired all this? What inspired you to become a writer and a filmmaker?
Yeah, I wrote my first book as a senior in high school. I'd finished my soccer season senior year and had all this time after school and decided to write a book. And then decided to dedicate that book to my girlfriend at the time as a way to ask her to prom. So that was my big motivator to finish the first book. And after that, it just became a habit. And I started writing, ended up self-publishing my 6th novel, which is 2084 on Amazon, did the whole virtual promotion circuits. And when I felt like I exhausted the digital promotion opportunities, I came up with this idea to promote it in real life, to take my first 50-day road trip, and the goal was to give away a copy of my self-published book to 50 different independent bookstores in 50 days. So it started as a self-promotional trip, but on that journey, I just fell in love with independent bookstores and decided that I wanted to take a second road trip and not make it about me, but make it about the booksellers and interview them. So I never had a moment where I decided to be a documentarian or to make documentaries about books. I just looked up one day and had a bunch of footage and decided that was my role. Huh. So that was my first film. It's a short documentary called The Bookstore. And then I started exploring different areas of the book world. The question that sort of precipitated the first film was, why should we shop indie as opposed to Amazon? But another important question I wanted to answer was, who's writing these books in the first place and why are they writing them? As a writer myself, I know how difficult it is and how unrewarding it can be. You'll toil for months in obscurity and then no one reads your work or people don't like your work. But there are people who are obsessed with the act of writing and storytelling. So the second film, called Story Road, is about the origin stories of famous authors who have strange paths to success. So people like Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian, who released chapters of the book as blog posts on his website. And eventually people got so annoyed with him for having to read blog posts to read the book, they're like, can you please just put it on Amazon? And he dragged his feet a little bit and said fine and put it up, and the book exploded. Christopher Paolini, who wrote the Aragon books back in the day, self-published his books and sold them out of the back of his father's truck, dressed up in medieval garb, and would stand in bookstores for 8 hours a day hand-selling his book. And these are all crazy things to do for something that, for a light at the end of the tunnel that isn't guaranteed. So through making that film, I understood my own motivations for writing, and I think of Books Across America as the third installment of this trilogy of bookish films, which asks a couple very basic questions about reading. namely, why do we read in a world where we have a smorgasbord of options of entertainment, easier, sexier options that we can consume stories? There are people who read, and that's a curious thing to me, and one of the questions I wanted to answer with the film.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm curious to hear more about like what you learned about bookstores in your first tour. I mean, bookstores, they had their their heyday when I was young and growing up, and they really went through a hard time, right? Amazon took over a lot of what bookstores did for a while. So
yeah.
Are indie bookstores alive and well from what you saw?
They are alive and thriving. Yeah, weirdly, though it was a very difficult time for them, the pandemic, it also catalyzed a period of growth. After we emerged from quarantine and isolation, we realized what we had been missing and what we were lacking in that time. And that's something that bookstores provide, the connection and interfacing with people. But through the course of making the film, we addressed the usual reasons people talk about for wanting to shop indie as opposed to your big box online stores. And that has to do with keeping money in the economy and the face-to-face interactions. And all those are solid reasons and important reasons. But the thing that I found the most compelling was the fact that indie booksellers just love selling books. Ones and zeros cannot love selling books. And I think if we support those sectors of the economy that can keep people passionate about their work, we will have created a better world. And there are few people more passionate about their work than booksellers are passionate about books.
I don't know if any of you have seen the Bookstore movie, but when I was watching it, there were a couple times when the book owners gave like a tour of the shop. They talked about how the shop was laid out and kind of just that experience of walking into it. And so that sense of like ownership and commitment to it, it really stood out.
That was one of the things that surprised me the most about the trip. You walk into a bookstore and you look around and you see thousands of books and you sort of take it for granted, or I do. But when we were making the film, I asked how those books got on the shelves. And there's someone who chooses each one of the books according to what people have read in the past in their community and what's going on in the larger world, and it's curated. It's not like you click a button on the big 5 publisher websites and they drop 10,000 books into your store. It's curated, and there's something about being in a room full of choices, of decisions that someone has made for your benefit that is very comforting and very warming, and that's what you get in a bookstore.
I think about the big box booksellers that came along, in the 90s, that changed that model a little bit. Go ahead.
Well, they upended the model. But I think people realize it sort of identified 2 different sectors or multiple sectors of the market. If you're buying books, people who love ebooks and you're buying just for the story in the book, and you want to spend as little money as possible on the book, shop Amazon. And booksellers will say the same thing. But if you're looking for a little bit extra in that experience, that's something that the bigger box stores have never been able to truly replicate. Barnes & Noble, they have physical locations, of course, but you can drop me in a Barnes & Noble in San Francisco, in Chicago, in London, in Indianapolis, and I will not know where I am. I'm in a Barnes & Noble, it's like being dropped in a McDonald's, and there's something very isolating about that experience that that's a problem that indie bookstores don't have.
I don't know if you've ever been to Warwick's here in San Diego.
I haven't.
So Warwick's is a local bookstore down in La Jolla.
Okay.
And they host, authors on a daily, weekly basis, right? I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. And what is amazing to me is I've never actually been able to get inside the bookstore for one of those author talks. I've always sat out on the sidewalk because it's so busy. And I think that it speaks to this role of the bookstore kind of in the community. It's a part of the community experience. And again, that stood out to me in that movie.
They become hubs in a world where we do a lot of our convening online or via Zoom. It's important to have physical locations. Libraries are great physical hubs for that sort of connection. But what you said about not being able to get into the store for the events. And makes me think of a story that Emma Straub told. She owns a bookstore in Brooklyn, also a very successful author in her own right. But she was talking about an event at Books Are Magic, her bookstore, where it was so busy that people were spilling out onto the sidewalk, and they had speakers playing the, like loudspeakers, like projecting the words into the bookstore. But the only way you could hear that outside is if you pressed your ears to the sidewalk. So it looked like, she said, it looked like there were 20 people outside of her shop praying to hear this writer speak, and that's so powerful.
Wow, okay. All right, that's an image. Okay.
Only in Brooklyn.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about the team. You obviously didn't film all this yourself. You had a couple of folks with you. What made you, or how did you get to convince them to go along?
Yeah, well, the team has changed over the course of the trilogy of films. So the bookstore was me and a cameraman intern who was a sophomore at Purdue at the time. So he couldn't even drink, and I was driving him around the country and having him point his camera at booksellers. The second, for Story Road, that was a revolving door of people that I worked with. There was one occasion when we interviewed Christopher Paolini. He lives in a somewhat isolated part of Montana, and there was no easy way to fly. Wherever I was flying to, I was gonna have to drive like 3 hours. So I ended up flying to Salt Lake City, taking my cousin's car, driving that to Idaho, picking up a cameraman, and then driving to Montana to film the interview. And I say all that to make the next statement seem a little less crazy. For Books Across America, it was 2 weeks before we took off. We started the trip January 12th and ended on March 2nd. That was our 50-day window. And around Christmas, I didn't have a crew. I had all the interviews scheduled and lined up, and I didn't have a cameraman or a driver or a van. So I was interviewing people off of Craigslist and Facebook, and Zoomed with some guy who had a camera and seemed qualified. He was very qualified, and we talked a couple times. But I met them on Facebook and on Craigslist.
That's like a whole nother level than finding your roommate on Craigslist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you lock yourself in a van with two crazy people for 50 days, that's gonna be really tough. And I should mention that they were a couple. They were boyfriend and girlfriend on the road, which is a risk of an entirely different sort.
Your second movie, Story Road, I mean, we just saw a clip where we talked about what would happen with a world without books. And you and I talked a little bit about just the compelling experience of storytelling. And so I wonder if I could just invite you to riff on what storytelling means to you for a moment.
Means to me. I think it means to me what it means for the authors we talked to in the film. But toward the end of that film, I asked Andy Weir and Hugh Howey and Chris Paolini and Nnedi Okorafor why they write despite all of the difficulty. And it boiled down to a very simple response, which was, I just want to tell stories. Chris Paolini is worth $40 million, has sold millions and millions of books, and he's sitting in a chair in this tiny little bookshop with me and some guy picked up in Idaho on my drive to Montana, and we're just talking about fantasy books. He's like, I love Lord of the Rings. I love the Wizard of Earthsea and these seminal books that he had read as a child, and all of that just resulted in this compulsion for him to tell stories, and that's true of the other authors as well. And that's something I'm still curious about, because I think we all accept the importance that stories play as consumers, but the second tier of being compelled to tell stories is a different thing. For me, most of my books, I've written 10 now, and I think the last one is almost good. Looking back on all of those stories are pieces of me, or they're articulations of things that I didn't know how to articulate at the time, so I needed 100,000 words to say what I felt. And I think that's the case for a lot of people who tell stories. They're just trying to tell their own story.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I remember a few of the authors you interviewed in Story Road, it was clear the stories had come from their experience, and they were talking about themselves as much as they were talking about the stories they were telling. I'm curious about the reading experience. I mean, like, why do you think reading is so compelling? You also pose that, right? We're inundated with information throughout our day, right? There's so many sources of ways to consume information. So why has reading remained popular?
Well, I think before you can answer the question of why reading survives despite all these other options, you have to ask what we get out of stories in general, whether that's movies or radio or theater. And I think, again, this is me speaking personally and trying to extrapolate to a universal, but I seek completion in stories that I don't get in real life. We're socialized to think of our life story and to view this 3-act, 5-act structure, and we see the American story, the American dream, and we hold that up against the story that we're living. And when those two don't match, we feel a dissonance. Or when something happens in our life, we have this quest that we go on, and we don't slay the dragon, or we don't get the girl, or whatever the resolution is when that doesn't happen. For me, at least, it's a feeling of, well, that's not right. If I were writing this story, it would have ended a different way. And but sometimes it just doesn't. So reading and consuming stories in general allows you to find that closure that you don't get. So for books in particular, there's something very powerful, something uniquely powerful about them in that regard, because you can participate in the story in a way that you can't participate in a movie. And that means creating the story in your own head. It's not being projected at you, but the wheels in your head have to turn to create the story. And by doing that, you're putting yourself in the story that has an ending, in the story that has closure. And you can experience that in a way that you can't just by watching it on screen. And it's also individualized. So you're not watching John McClane save the day. You're saving the day as the character that you're creating. So I think it's the participatory nature of stories and the individual nature, of books, and the individual nature of books that keep them unique and keep them relevant.
Oh, that's really interesting. In libraries, we talk a lot about sense making and how you internalize knowledge, how you take in information and turn it into something that is personal and understood, and it helps with memory. It helps with teaching and all sorts of things that come out of that. Did the authors you speak with have kind of a common concept around storytelling? Did they share your view, or did you hear other views of this?
Weirdly, I didn't ask. You get into the editing room with these projects and you're going through the interviews and you think, you idiot, why didn't you ask that question? It took me the 50-day road trip and going through all the footage to realize the question that I should have asked. So my challenge now as the filmmaker is to take these incomplete snippets of thoughts and forge them into something whole. So unfortunately, I didn't ask Joyce Carol Oates the questions that I wanted to ask her, and Pastor, any of these people, but they gave me enough to hint at the truth that I want to reach.
Wow. All right. So, you just said that reading is this unique experience, and I totally agree. And yet you've created incredibly compelling documentaries. So how does that relate? What's storytelling like in the documentary sense?
Yeah, well first, it does seem odd that if you're talking about the value of books, write a book about it, right? But my goal is not to preach to the choir of book lovers. I want to evangelize books. And the only way you can do that is by tricking people into watching a movie about books. So that's the real goal of the documentary. And you cloak it in this very gimmicky thing, a travel documentary, a challenge documentary of 50 states in 50 days. And really, I'm gonna make you love books. But the act of making a documentary is so different from writing a novel. I was just thinking about this recently because I'm having a little bit of trouble doing it. In a book, you can start with a character, you start with a premise, and you build out from there. And there's no budget constraints and you can create whatever you need. In a documentary, if you're shooting verite footage, you film what happens and then you find the through line through what happens. In a project like mine, you start with a framework and then you film the interviews and then you have to find the story afterward. So when I was first conceiving the road trip, I knew there had to be some sort of pre-planned arc through the country. I couldn't just ask the same questions to 50 different authors and hope I could come up with a story. So I had different focuses in the region. We were asking different questions. But I was so busy with the logistics of the road trip and emailing the authors and the publicists to set everything up that, again, this is getting very late in the process, and I realized I'm not really sure. I know I'm taking a road trip that's lasting 50 days, but what is the story? And I was alone in LA for Thanksgiving because I was too cheap to fly home to see my parents. And I just walked around the city for 6 hours thinking about the story and laying out the interviews in a way that I thought would tee up that story when I got to the edit. But now it's 70 plus hours of footage and 35 terabytes. So whatever thought went into the beginning is kind of irrelevant. You just have to work with what you have. So it's a lot of puzzle making.
I mean, I'm even overwhelmed just hearing 70 hours of footage. How do you find a storyline through all that footage?
I'll let you know.
So the other thing that I just was amazed with was getting to see these authors up close that you interviewed. I think somewhere in kind of one of the clips I saw, it wasn't said exactly this way, but like authors are real people. And so I was just maybe, could you reflect a little bit about like what you learned about authors? You got to speak obviously with 50 of them, more than that.
Yeah. So I'll start with a quick story about the fact that authors are real people. We were in Princeton, New Jersey, filming around campus. Every place we would go to, we would throw up the drone. Jerome, the drone is his name, and get footage of the surrounding area just to provide some texture and some context for the interview. We're doing that in Princeton, and I checked my email, and I got an email from Joyce Carol Oates, who was our interview in New Jersey. And she said, hey, it's a little bit windier than I expected, and it's getting darker faster. This is early February at this point. And Joyce is getting up there in years. She's been around for a while. So she's like, can you pick me up before the interview? And I said, of course, Joyce. We will absolutely pick you up. So my assistant director drove Chrissy the Chrysler, who you met earlier, this pigsty of a vehicle to go pick up one of the most legendary authors of our time because she's a person and she doesn't like to drive at night because she's elderly. So that drove the point home in a very cool way. Someone that I had read, and I got to drop her off after the interview, someone I read in English class, I could just have a conversation with, not about books, but it was cool to meet people that you would read, because I would read the book. So for Joyce, I read her memoir on writing, and I would read that book before the interview. And before talking to James Patterson, I read the latest Alex Cross novel before the interview. And Ann Patchett, I read her book of essays before the interview. So I spend anywhere from 4 to 8 hours with the author through their book before the interview, and you establish these preconceived notions of what that person is going to be like. And I was wrong every single time. Yeah, it was cool to hear the author's voice. We talk about a writer's voice on the page, and then to hear their voice and how different those two were. That was one of the things I noticed consistently.
That would be, all right, so that's fascinating. I think I'd be completely intimidated if I read your book and then had to come interview you. Was that intimidating for you?
Yes, yeah, it was, especially having to read rather quickly. There was one author, do you know Tiari Jones? She wrote An American Marriage. It was an Oprah Book Club pick a few years back. And she is, I think, the director of the creative writing program at, correct me, is it Emerson or Emory that's in Atlanta?
Emory.
Emory. Everyone got that one, thank you. Very prestigious, very smart woman writing about a tough topic in mass incarceration and a love story woven through that. I have to read the book in 6 hours and from scratch create an interview to ask her questions about the book. And that was super intimidating. But my solution was to just get up early and spend 10 hours with the book while we're filming on the road and getting B-roll of the state sign and different things like that. So my solution was just to be as prepared as possible, but I was intimidated in a constant state of anxiety for 50 days.
So there was this a great quote in Story Road that was, behind every book there's an author, and behind every author there's a love of books. I don't think I heard a single author you interviewed say, this is okay. I could take it or leave it. I'm thinking of a different career path. I think I even heard them say, like, I would stick with this even if I wasn't going to sell a book. Was that your read as well? Yeah, there was one part of the movie, I would do individual interviews with these famous authors, and then the other through line of the film was a writer roundtable, when I got together with 3 aspiring writers in Los Angeles and just asked them about their process and where they are, and sort of juxtapose the journeys of these famous authors. And at the very end of that roundtable, I asked them, I posed a scenario where their future selves would come back and tell them, hey, by the way, no one's ever gonna read your work. You're not gonna sell more than 200 copies. This just isn't gonna work out commercially. And I asked them if they would continue to write after hearing that. And universally, it's one clip, one cut. They go around the table and they say, yes, yes, yes. No explanation, as though it needs none. And I thought that was so much more powerful than someone trying to explain the compulsion to tell stories. It's just a fact. You ask why so many times until you get down to a root level feeling something about you as a person that's tied to your soul, and they just say, yes, I tell stories. Huh. Wow. So something else I learned is that the pathway to becoming a successful author is a challenging pathway. Maybe I won't even ask a leading question there. Could you chat a little bit about like what some of these authors experienced, how they became successful, and maybe, I don't know, did you meet an unsuccessful author?
Well, I have plenty of experience with unsuccessful authors, being one I would consider. But talking to Paolini and Andy Weir, Hugh Howey, and Nnedi Okorafor, that was the big 4. Nnedi had the most traditional path. She got an agent and then got published, won a bunch of awards, and then became a bestseller. It's funny how you win awards first and then become a bestseller. I think that's telling in some genres. But for the 3 guys, they sort of stumbled into success, and it wasn't a consistent formula that we saw across the 3 of them, which was a little disheartening for a type A person who likes to hack success and finds rules and formulas and clear paths. So that for me was an awakening, because it challenged my motivations for writing. I found myself being disappointed in the fact that success can, for many people, be sort of random. And I realized that I was placing more importance on that than the writing itself, which I think people can feel. If you're reading a book, you don't want to feel like you're being sold to, or like you're a member of the market that is being gamed for someone else's success. You want to feel someone's love for a story. And if you're too focused on the commercial aspects, then you lose that love. So it's like, I'm a big Harry Potter fan, so it's like looking into the mirror of Erised. You can only get the Sorcerer's Stone if you want it not to use it. It feels like that for writers. You can only write a great book and sell 1 million copies if you don't care about selling 1 million copies. You just want to write a great book.
Okay, that's hard to live up to, I guess. One of your authors, I forget which one, talked about like the role of Amazon, and the role of Amazon like going viral. And so I'm just curious, is that a more universal experience, or was it truly that person was just really lucky?
Yeah, I actually tried to that's how I connected with Andy Weir initially. About a year after he released The Martian and the movie got made, I researched his path and saw that he had built up a following on his blog and then released the book on his blog and then took it to Amazon. And that felt repeatable to me. You build up a following, you release and you promote really hard, and then you blow up and Matt Damon is in your movie. It seemed very simple. So I emailed him and said, hey, Andy, how many blog followers did you have when you started releasing chapters of your book? And he said, 3,000. So I said, okay, great. Let me get 3,000 blog followers and I'll become a famous author. And that was my whole goal with 2084. I started with a short story version of the book to build an email list. I kind of left the short story with a cliffhanger to get people to subscribe to read the rest. And then built up a large following, released the book, and lo and behold, Matt Damon does not know who I am. Because,
not yet.
Because it isn't a formula. So the going viral on Amazon, Wool, if you guys have seen Silo on Apple TV, that's an adaptation of the Hugh Howey book, Wool. He went viral, he just posted a short story on Amazon and it got thousands and thousands of downloads for no real reason. 50 Shades of Grey is another example. There's probably a clear reason for why people downloaded that book. But the short answer is no, there's not a clear way to hack the Amazon algorithm. It just seems to pick people at random.
Huh. And has all of that changed how authors write? I mean, has the Amazon and the internet and social media and kind of this self-promotion aspect, is it different now, or am I just like seeing a technology instance of a continuum that's been around for a long time?
To a certain extent, I think so. But for authors, it has changed things. If you want to be an independent author and make money on Amazon, there are things that you do. You can't guarantee that you'll go viral, but if you write books in a series, if you write shorter books so you can write more books, if you make the first book free and get people started on your series, they'll pay for the rest. If you pay for ads, so the author now is his or her own publisher and has to do the promotional aspect. So I think for the writer, it filters a different sort of person and enables, it incentivizes different kinds of people to succeed, because not only do you have to write good books, you have to be a good marketer, you have to be tech savvy, you have to be all these other things. So I think it's the market of writers has sort of bifurcated into the self-publishing folks who can wear all of the hats, and the old guard who just want to write and be published by the publishers and let them do all of that. So it's definitely shaken up the publishing world. But there are great stories that come out of self-published authors. I self-publish, so I have to say that. But yeah, it's shaking things up.
I mean, yeah, the notion of self-publishing, I mean, that's not purely a digital phenomenon, right? I mean, you could self-publish in the print world.
Yeah.
And many folks do. It's interesting how self-publishing is a little more normalized now, right? It's being with a publisher is not necessarily that kind of stamp of approval that guarantees success the way I think it may have used to be perceived.
Yeah. Speaking of Hugh Howey, he was, I believe, the first traditionally published author to broker a deal with his publisher where the publisher owns the print rights and he owns the ebook rights, because he just knew he was better at promoting his ebooks than the publisher would be. And that's become more common. If you're a heavyweight in publishing, you can negotiate for your ebook rights. And there are people like Brandon Sanderson, a famous fantasy author who we interviewed in Utah, who will do a certain number of books per year with his publisher and then self-publish a book or the next book in a certain series that he does. So there's this hybrid approach that people are taking now to maximize their book sales. And it's a valid approach. People are doing very well with it.
Wow. All right, so we've definitely saved some time for all of you to ask questions of Mason. So I think we have a couple mics that we'll bring out. Maybe if I could just ask one last question. I mean, you've chatted with tons of people. Was there like a favorite interview or an interview that just really stands out you'd like to share with us?
I have multiple favorites. I'll give two. One was with a poet named Kaveh Akbar in Iowa City, Iowa. He's a professor of poetry at the university there. And after reading, this is an example of my mismatch of perceptions, but after reading his book of poetry, which was stunning and very thoughtful and very rhythmic and very intelligent, I expected this very like old school professorly type who, and I know there are a lot of professors in the room, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, this is just what I expected. I expected him to be a certain way, and he walked in like this goofy guy just asking us about the trip and smiling. And he said something that really stuck with me, which was, thank you. Thank you for interviewing me. I think you're making something very important, and I'm just so grateful to be a part of it. This was like day 14 for us, and no one had said that yet because I'm too busy thanking the authors. We're talking to Kristen Hanna and James Lee Burke and legends in their genre, and I'm saying thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And he was the first person to say, I'm just so grateful. And that was awesome to hear. Another favorite was Ken Liu in Massachusetts. He's a Hugo Award winner and probably the smartest human I've ever talked to in real life. But he spoke very intelligently, I thought, about the American story and how there is not an American story, how we cannot agree on a certain thing that is America, but we're a spectrum, and we can exist as such. And the power of books is that they can represent different niches of that spectrum and allow us to experience the different American stories so we can cohere as Americans. And the way he said that, I come back to his interview as I look for the story in the documentary and the edit.
Wow. All right, that's amazing. All right, let me turn to all of you.
Could you talk about generational differences in terms of reading, both authors and readers? And what do you think the impact long range is of ebooks? And I also enjoy audible versions of books, especially those read by the authors. You know, I get another dimension to it when I'm reading and also listening at the same time.
So about the different mediums and the different generations and how people tell stories, I've asked I asked a version of this question to the authors we talked to on the road about the value of print books. And of course, being authors, many of them are in love with the physical objects. But there were plenty who said, and Ken Liu was one of them, he said, I don't really care where you're reading. If you're reading long-form story threads on Twitter or on these different apps that pop up as different modes for consuming stories, that's cool, as long as you're reading, as long as you're partaking in stories. As for the generational gap, I think it's a tough problem, and I would call it a problem. But the young adult genre is one of the most consistent and fastest growing parts of the publishing industry. Of course, there are non-young people, is that the politically correct way of saying, who read in that genre, but there's also a clear sign that young people are continuing to pick up books. So there's a tendency now to catastrophize in general, but to catastrophize around books, I don't think it's as dire of a situation as people make it out to be, which is very heartening. And generationally authors approach the challenge differently. If you're a younger author, you're more likely to be on TikTok and so forth, which is great because they're reaching the people on TikTok who are largely young people and are bringing them to books. So as long as we as authors can adapt to the market, I think we'll continue bringing young people to read it.
Thank you. I think we have one over here.
I'm just curious about the mechanics. How many hours were you driving and how many hours were you sleeping?
We drove more than we slept. So the average, this was the fun part for me. I was a math major at Purdue, so the first challenge of the trip was an optimization problem, geographically, how to get to all 50 states in the least amount of time and miles. So the average amount of driving is about 6 to 8 hours a day, 5 to 8, a little more generous. And the longer driving days were in the Pacific Northwest, where you just have big states. There's no optimizing you can do that can get you across Montana faster. So about 5 to 8 hours of driving per day. One detail about the driving, I was looking forward to getting to the Northeast because I knew we would have less driving. You go from Connecticut to Rhode Island and it's been 30 minutes. I thought that'd be a good thing. But I did all of my reading on the road in the van when we were going from place to place. And Nick, my camera guy, loves Jerome the drone and wanted to get as much cool footage because that's his job. So we would do more B-roll in the Northeast because we had more time in each place we went to, which gave me less reading time, which meant I had to stay up later and get up earlier to finish the books, which is my segue to the sleeping question. About 3 to 5 hours a night, which was the hardest parts because it's a hard trip to begin with. You do that on an empty tank, it just gets a lot harder.
Wow. No. That would be tough. All right. Yes.
Hi, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and back then, 1950s, we had this big scandal of pay for play for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and what have you. What have you found with Amazon for advertising and advertising or controlling the book sales?
So there are a couple of different angles to the question. The first is Amazon and its ad structure has allowed authors of means to immediately appear higher in the search rankings. If you throw a bunch of money at advertising, then people are going to see your book, more people are going to download it, and it's just reinforcing the same cycle. So Amazon has widened the disparity between authors, successful authors and aspiring authors, which in general I think is a bad thing because it de-incentivizes new authors to enter the market. As for how that affects the larger landscape of publishing and the big five publishers and their relationship with the market, that's something that I don't know as much about. But there's a gentleman, actually a bookseller in Kansas, who wrote a pamphlet called How to Resist Amazon and Why. That goes very deep into that. That pamphlet was actually what catalyzed my interest in independent bookstores. So I don't have a great answer for you, but it is a great question.
In hindsight, on your calculating your route and just the logistics of it, and I understand that 50 authors in 50 days is a very great hook for marketing and all of that. But in hindsight, do you kind of wish you'd done 50 authors in 100 days? Number one. And number two, what if you had done your route in reverse? Do you think the sequence of interviewing people would have made a difference?
Yeah, it would have changed everything. First, it would have changed the questions that I asked because I knew we wanted to end on a certain note. But I'm so glad we did it the way we did because our final interview in the continental United States was Leigh Bardugo, who writes the Ninth House books and the Grishaverse books, now a Netflix show. And she spoke very philosophically about reading and the act of reading in a way that no other author had. And if we had opened with that, it wouldn't have made sense. So there's so much about the trip that, there are those moments when I'm watching the footage and I think, why didn't I ask that question? But there are other moments when I think, oh my gosh, I know I'm not a genius, so this must be luck, because things are just falling into place in the right ways. So changing the sequence would have changed all of that. And I've completely forgotten your first question. Oh yeah, yes. My crew already wants to do Nick and Olivia, the happy couple, still a happy couple, by the way. They're suggesting we do another 50-day trip around Europe this time, 50 countries in 50 days. And I say, this is, again, we're skimming the surface. It would be nice to spend like a week in each place. So we could spend, we have 52 weeks in a year, 2 weeks off, and we spend a week in each state. We could go a lot deeper, and I think that would be a lot of fun. My hope is to after this film produce a documentary series that's kind of a parts unknown for the book world. And to do something like that, we would have to spend more time in each place.
Again, this is an issue regarding logistics. How did you figure out 50 authors and which books to read, and how did that all get put together? I can see that maybe there were authors that you would have liked that weren't available. How did that work?
Being a math guy and being from Purdue, I have very techie friends. So my first step in selecting the authors was to pull from the New York Times bestseller API, their database, and have this monster list of authors who are bestsellers. Because speaking of the marketing gimmick, we knew we needed the James Pattersons and the Ann Patchetts and the so forth to attract people to the film. So after having this list of popular authors, basically, I hired someone to find out the state of residence of each author, and then the number of reviews of their most popular book on Amazon, and then we could filter by popularity of state. And then you also have different characteristics to take into account, being demographic, sexual orientation. You want a very representative slice of the country and the authors. So the short version of the answer is, it was weighing a lot of different variables and trying to prioritize which people to ask. And after being rejected by 1, 2, and 3 people in a certain state, continuing to maintain the balance that I was going for initially. So it was again fun for a math mind, but definitely a big challenge at the outset.
Wow, that's impressive.
Go Boilermakers.
Boiler up.
Obviously, not all of the authors were bestsellers. Not all of the books were bestsellers, some better than others. Did you find that you liked the best-selling books better? And were there some characteristics of the best-selling books that made them bestsellers?
My favorite book from the road trip was not a bestseller. It was from an author who was not yet a bestseller, Michael Ferris Smith in Mississippi. His most recent book is Salvage This World. It's about a war-torn piece of Mississippi and Louisiana and this gothic, paranormal Southern mystery, which is nothing close to what I read normally. But I did notice a difference in his writing with regard to the voice, because picking up a standard best-selling mystery, say, though there are different best-selling mystery authors, their voices are all pretty similar, in my opinion. Maybe that's just me not being well-read in mysteries, but they seem similar. And Michael's book, at the end of the first page, I knew I was reading an author I'd never read before. And it's like going into an indie bookstore and feeling the uniqueness as opposed to being in a big box store and feeling and not feeling that. So the uniqueness of the voice was the biggest difference for me, and the biggest consistency that I noticed across the bestsellers.
Anything that you noticed that would make a book the bestseller? Any characteristics?
If I could answer that question, I would have a bestseller. So no, not yet, but I'm still looking.
Well, Mason, it has really been a pleasure talking with you tonight. Your work is amazing. We really look forward to seeing your next movie when it comes out.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for reading.
Yeah.